The village of High Peak was always a small hamlet at the outskirts of pretty much everything, populated by kind and humble folk who sought refuge from the larger and more important comings and goings and hustle and bustle of the kingdom of Talingard. Founded by refugees from the Great Wars, they had always relied upon their isolation for protection. Because of this, few noticed the strangely dressed man that appeared one morning on the outskirts of town. Old Man Jack was the first to see him, the man appearing as out of nowhere in the mist on the field of the old Wolfswift homestead. The folk of High Peak did avoid that place usually. Rumors abound with ghosts and magic, made for fearful stories. Still, Jack was the closest neighbor to the place, and as he peered at the figure passing by, he thought that he should at least greet this newcomer to the town. But as he opened his mouth to call out his greeting, the mists parted for a second, and Jack's heart almost stopped. The man was dressed in fine clothing, black with silver trimmings, and a long leather coat flowing behind him like a wraith. Strange lights slowly followed him, and he was, to Jack's surprise, not actually walking, but seemingly floating slightly above the ground. However, it was not the man's strange attire that caused the old farmer to feel as if all hope was lost. No, it was his eyes, cold, dead, with a malevolent shine that spoke of nothing but death and ruin, and not just for Jack, but for everything. The sense of dread and death palpable, Jack felt as he was almost suffocating standing there. He turned and fled, saying nothing, for he could not speak. Fear and terror, a deathly grip upon his throat. As he desperately slammed shut his door and locked it, he caught a glimpse of the figure again. This time he was not alone. To his horror, Jack saw that many marched with the strange man. Bones gleaming in the moist mist, rusty weapons, exposed rotten flesh, and visages of death. The strange man glided into High Peak, and the dead walked with him. 10 years ago. The Wolfswift homestead on the outskirts of High Peak had had a reputation for years, with tales abound that Aisha and Davry Wolfswift were practicing magic. How else would you explain their abundant crops, the fat pigs, and the long visits from the sins passed on Sage Mar? The Wolfswifts were friendly though, and many in town did certainly like them. The idyllic life was to be short-lived, however, as the night of the Holy Purification, enacted by Inquisitor Leopold Hawklight, who sought to further his career by taking the holy light of the Inquisition to the most remote and, to his mind, most needing communities of the kingdom, struck High Peak like a glowing hot hammer. When the ambitious Inquisitor first arrived in town, he declared grandly that it was infested with evil, and that damnation was near, and that only he could save them all. The humble folk of High Peak were awed and terrified by the holy man and his armed cohorts, and few dared resist. In his fanatic search for evil to root out, the holy man, in his questioning of the inhabitants of High Peak, heard tales of the Wolfswifts and their supposed powers. It did not take long until he and his men descended upon the farm with great and holy vengeance. Finding the beautiful Aisha with a newborn baby boy, but no husband, Davry, Hawklight dragged Aisha into town for questioning and to stand trial. Left to the tender ministrations of the Inquisition, Aisha revealed that not only had magic been employed to make life easier on the farm, something even more damning has taken place. Davrir, her husband, were researching even more spells. And so, her guilt established, she hanged, her mutilated and mangled corpse on display with 20 other inhabitants in the great tree in the middle of the town square, the burned-in F for Forsaken branded upon her flesh. The homestead of the Wolf-Swifts got rendered into ash and ruin, and holy water sprinkled upon the remains to purify the ground from such blasphemy. But whatever fanaticism drove Inquisitor Hawklight to such measures, he could not bring himself to harm the small baby boy. Declaring the boy's soul to be property of the church, he spirited him away in secret to be taught in the goodness and light of the Mithran church and faith, never to know his parents' fate or his own heritage. But Hawklight was not done. Davrir Wolf-Swift was still at large. A few days later, upon returning from his first and, as it turned out, last sojourn to the capital, Davrir Wolf-Swift learned the grim fate of his family from his friend and neighbor Jack Holm. Davrir, at the news of this, fell into a catatonic state. Raving and feverish, he plunged into despair and the darkness of the void. His wife and child murdered for a crime they did not commit, and only to further the ambitions of a few self-proclaimed elect. His mind reeled at the realization, and the winds of madness threatened to take him and flay his soul. Dark thoughts and plans swirled before him. How could the supposed God of Light allow such a thing to happen? The sanctimonious garbage that the faithful spewed was nothing worth at all. They had made that abundantly clear with their actions. The faith was an illusion, to hold the ones in power in place and nothing else. Mithra, a false god, a hollow shell for the self-righteous and the delusional to fill with their own weak ambition. He would get his revenge for this, for it all. He would find a way to bring them both back. He had read about this happening. He knew it was possible, but how? He needed to think, to plan, to stem the rising tide of chaos in his mind. In the middle of the night, 2 days later, he awoke with cold determination. Leaving his friend's house, he made his way into town, using the old tunnels and passageways to steal into the town square. He recovered Aisha's body and took it with him. Gathering up the few things he could, along with his old teacher, the sage Mar's research, he set out into Talengard to find vengeance. That day, Davrir Wolf-Swift died, and instead Zacharias Raith was born. Spending many years doing research and many journeys to gather rare materials, Zacharias was finally ready for his attempt. Summoning the energies of life and unlife, he cast his will upon the ether to wrest from Mithra the soul of his beloved Aisha. But at the height of the ritual, when he could feel her spirit approaching, he was interrupted. Inquisitor Leopold Hawklight had found him. Zacharias screamed in desperation as he saw his ritual being destroyed in front of him. He tried to fight, but there were too many. The last thing he remembered was the Inquisitor's triumphant and pleased smile as he pronounced his judgment. "For the crime of heresy and consorting with the dark arts of necromancy, you are hereby forsaken. You will be taken to Brandonscar prison to stand trial, and then burned at the stake. May Mithra have mercy upon your wretched soul." Present day. The screams, the terrible screams. Old man Jack could barely move. All around him the air roiled with terrible shouts of angst and pain, the screams echoing from within High Peak. Dark and terrible energy swirling, switching between sickly green and purple light, lighting up the sky. Creatures from the very stuff of nightmares seen just as hazy glimpses from within the mist. forms stumbling about, being cut down only to rise again, rain with black oily drops falling like bullets and lightning streaking across the sky, shaking the very town to its core. The trees twisting, dying and splintering along with reality itself, as if someone had taken a hammer to a mirror. Old Jack felt himself grow older and weaker every second, as if the terrible maelstrom of souls and pain flayed the land of all life, all hope. The town priest, Father Diego, tried to ward off the evil and gave the people sanctuary within the church. Jack saw him usher many in at the beginning of the slaughter, and the holy doors held for a time. But the titanic forces unleashed, ripped and teared at the old church, and not even Mithra's holy was safe. As the storm of death reached its crescendo, as the last of the living cried out their dread, the church collapsed. The stained glass windows exploded outwards in a shower of razor shards. The clock tower creaked and groaned and finally toppled, the great bell, once pride of the town, coming crashing down and split in twain. Jack then saw Father Diego floating in the air above the now exposed altar of the church, his arms and legs outstretched as if held aloft by invisible iron bands, the wraith-like mists and sickly green and purple energy shooting for him and turning him into ash. A flash of lightning cast the town square in stark light, and old Jack saw the stranger, his arms lifting, holding aloft a wicked dagger made of wood. It almost looked like a branch from the great tree in the town square, Jack somehow managed to think, before the stranger plunged the dagger into his own heart, and everything went black. The last thing Jack heard was the screams of the damned, and through it, even more terrifyingly, cold and triumphant laughter. It has been months. The sun never shines like it used to anymore over High Peak. Even on the brightest of spring days, it is just a hazy gloom in the town's environs. The people changed. Those who survived that fateful day are twisted and dark of mind, their eyes clouded with what seems to be a black oily film. Crops grow, but they are either withered and twisted or bulbous and corrupted. The few children who are born alive at all are born either monstrosities that quickly disappear or malformed. The dead do not rest anymore and are thus burned to prevent them from rising. The only creatures fat and full are the unnaturally large ravens. These dark sentinels can be seen in great flocks flying over High Peak and its surrounding countryside, and some say they have seen them strip the flesh of a man's bones in minutes. Travelers entering the village do rarely return, and if they do, they seem changed. The only warning that something is amiss is the crazy old hermit living in a shack next to the road at the bottom of the mountain path leading up to High Peak. He warns all travelers on the road, urging them to turn back. "Do not go there, my lords! Do not throw your lives away on such a fool's errand! The town is doomed! Death lies upon it, and everything around it. But if you somehow must go, if this is some fool's errand you are on, remember this: do not eat anything offered. Do not drink the water, and whatever you do, do not stay until after dark." May Mithra have mercy upon your soul if you go to High Peak, my lord.